just introducing myself and thank you, Mitchell, for all your hard work bringing so many important people to this discussion today. I'm, like all of you, incredibly bummed out not to be sitting in a room together. I'm based in the DC area, but I practice law in Georgia and maintain Georgia practice as well as really a nationwide practice. I'm a paraplegic. I sustained a spinal cord injury many years ago, um, as a result of a defect in a car. And so I was a back passenger in the middle seat that only had a lap belt. And so when the car hit a tree, it held my abdomen in, but the rest of my body went forward. And from that process, I was very young at the time, but I went on to go to college and law school, practice law in Atlanta. And ultimately, when I had wheeled away from the stability of a paycheck, I determined if I was ever going to be brave enough to start my own law firm, it was going to be then. And so I started the spinal cord injury law firm, a very focused law firm in helping people with spinal cord injuries. Now, I know many of you are like, oh God, we have to listen to a lawyer, because I'm not like necessarily the person that people want to hear from sometimes. But I hope today to like bring some perspective. I know some of you are in the healthcare sphere, and you know a lot of these facts and figures, and we can all, from our own experiences, understand what these hard costs are for after a spinal cord injury. But before I do that, I'm gonna also share right now in the chat. There's it's a facts and figures sheet. I think so. The University of Alabama at Birmingham, there's the National Spinal Cord Injury Statistical Center, and they put out a document every year, just kind of the nitty-gritty of spinal cord injuries. And what we know is that the prevalence of spinal cord injuries as a result of gun violence is on the rise. And today it represents about 15% of all of individuals with spinal cord injuries. And so if you don't know about the National Spinal Cord Injury Statistical Center, now you do. They put a lot of good facts and figures together that really help us better understand the progression of spinal cord injuries, from who it's affecting, how it's affecting them, and so forth. So starting there. So when I started my law firm, oftentimes I was looking at how someone becomes spinal cord injured. And I'm a part of a national group of lawyers who help represent individuals following whatever may happen that has caused them harm. And there was a work group related to gun violence, and I started showing up to those meetings. And wanting to better understand, what other people are doing related to helping people after gun violence in a legal capacity. What I determined was that most of these individuals were unfortunately dealing maybe with like a lot of them were dealing with mass shootings, and certainly with that being on the rise, was very important work. But the reality was, for many people, they were representing people whose family members had lost their lives as a result of gun violence. And I was coming into the discussion and at the table talking about the people who have survived but are now in a situation of living a much different life, having to rebuild piece by piece, and understanding the tremendous cost of that reality. What I tell people all the time is spinal cord injuries are the most expensive injuries that you can have, because they're significant, and for most people, they're permanent. And so you're not just looking at what it costs to be in the ICU setting or a rehab setting, but what are the costs for someone to go on and live their lives as a person with a spinal cord injury. And so, we as a group of lawyers really trying to address gun violence in a legal capacity are up against a lot of challenges. Here are some of the ways that I'm looking at gun violence from a legal perspective. Now, here's one way I'm not looking at it, and that's unfortunately because of federal legislation. We are not able to really look at it from the perspective of holding gun manufacturers accountable for the guns that are on our streets and in our communities. That's because in 2005, there was a federal piece of legislation passed called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, the PLCAA. And that essentially gave gun manufacturers full immunity from ever being held accountable for the amount of guns and the actions that those, or the consequences of what those guns are causing to be in our communities. What we know now is state by state. There are some like New York or California who have decided to take on a state level actions to provide some amount of accountability to gun manufacturers, but not a lot, to be honest. And certainly Georgia is not one of those states in this moment. So that is one way we are not able to look at the a legal aspect of gun violence. There are consumer protection ways, sometimes like a product liability if the gun had a defect on it that caused it to engage when it shouldn't have. But that's really in this moment in time off the table. So another way we look at and the reason why I go through an analysis of, as a lawyer, how can I, and as a person who lives with a spinal cord injury and who has lived with a spinal cord injury for decades now, how can I help a person who has been shot and paralyzed, knowing the substantial costs that they're going to face for their lifetime? Another way is to look at where the gun violence occurred. And so if it was occurring, so some of the cases I take on are related to, was there a person was paralyzed related to gun violence because they were at a mall or a strip mall, and there was a lack of security that's called like negligent security cases, premise liability cases. So that's the main way I'm evaluating if someone may have a legal action that can provide some amount of potential financial recovery after gun violence. And so, I'm telling you all this because sometimes people don't know that they may have a way to pursue action. And once we get into these figures, and hopefully I'll be able to share my screen in a sec, you'll know why this becomes so important. The other thing I like to tell people is we're looking at, and I'm going to talk a little bit about life care plans today. A life care plan is kind of in the capsule of a legal action, but it's documenting hard costs on what a person who had been living life without a spinal cord injury, and in this case now has a spinal cord injury, and what it's going to cost them to continue to live life kind of at that same level in light of the fact that now they have paralysis. And those numbers, and the numbers I'm going to give you today are very conservative. These numbers are huge. And what I often get a lot of pushback on is a person with a spinal cord injury is not going to live a certain amount of years as they would but for their spinal cord injury. If they had not had their spinal cord injury, they would have lived this many years. And now as a result of their spinal cord injury, they're going to live less. They're going to not have as long of a life. And I say, no, not true. And here's why. If the right resources, if the right supports are in the place, if the right caregiving, if the right housing, if the right transportation, if the right medical care, if all those pieces are intact, a person with a spinal cord injury absolutely has the ability to live as long of a life as they would have had but for their spinal cord injury. But that takes a lot of money, like a whole lot of money. And we know that Medicaid only goes so far, and it can be very challenging. Let me go ahead and see if I'm going to pull up my screen, the right place here. Let me. We all are seeing my very not fancy screen, but do y'all see it, Mitchell?
Yep, we do.
Okay. So, again, like I said, as I'm very fortunate I think, in that basically every part of my life, like, is centered around being a part of or being associated with people with spinal cord injuries. I live life as a person with a spinal cord injury. All of my work is involved with it, much of my like volunteer work. Like, there's really no aspect of my life that is untouched by spinal cord injuries. And so I take like really understanding the landscape of our world very seriously. So, like I said, what we're seeing year in to year is gun violence is causing more and more and more spinal cord injuries. There's about 18,000 new spinal cord injuries per year. And right now, about 15% of those are caused by firearms. Um, and that's a lot. I mean, we're always going to have the car wrecks, the falls, other things, but like seeing this number incrementally rise every year, I know all of us in this discussion today care about this tremendously, but we need everyone else to care about this because this number is not going down, it is going up year to year. Um, and we have to understand really, that a disproportionate amount of the impact is young men of color, and very under-resourced communities. One thing I wanted to give as a tidbit um, of information is someone, I think it was April, who talked about maybe fundraising or like, hey, I can't, like, I mean, it's hard to just call upon your family to help like support and fund you through a spinal cord injury because the costs are crazy and they're ongoing and they're never ending. I wanted to bring up as a resource a nonprofit. It's called Help Hope Live. Um, it is not the same as GoFundMe, but it is in many respects like an alternative to GoFundMe. And the reason GoFundMe gives me angst is because oftentimes what we see is that can ultimately end up being counted as income for an individual, which means that they could be precluded from government services like Medicaid or SSI, SSDI, just because their family is very well intentioned by starting a GoFundMe for their benefit. Help Hope Live is a nonprofit that allows the money to be put in for the benefit of a person, but in a way that it would not count as income or jeopardize someone's government benefits. I'll try when I go back on the full screen, I'll put a link to Help Hope Live there. If you want to be connected to them, let me know. They also have like a whole staff around helping people set up successful campaigns because again, spinal cord injury is a continuum, it's a journey of the person's life, and what their needs are immediately following an injury is not going to be the same as maybe they need an adapted vehicle 10 years down the road, or they don't have voc rehab being able to provide that. So that's just one thing I wanted to bring up. And there are some very dedicated efforts within Help Hope Live in reaching into communities that are largely affected by gun violence to help educate them that there are ways for them to get more resources to help them. Okay, so when we're looking at the immediate medical cost of gun-related SCI, I know there's doctors in here, people within the acute medical setting. You all know this, but sometimes it depends the level of injury. We've heard from people who have different levels of injury. I'm considered a paraplegic. And then tetraplegia, also known as quadriplegia, kind of as a personal preference, I think at this point, what it's referred to as. I think in the medical setting, they're going more towards tetraplegia, but a high level, which may include like a vent or something, those costs go up very high. Because the amount of people who can provide resources, medical facilities is very low, and the needs are very high. And so we're looking at very, very high immediate costs. And for many people who have to, very quickly get on Medicaid or other government services, some of these costs can fall through the cracks and land on families, often causing, medical bankruptcy and other things that are very difficult. And so after you get out of that phase, again, with the right supports, with the right team in place, with the right caregiving, the secondary complications can go down significantly. The one I'm most passionate about is reducing the prevalence of pressure sores following spinal cord injuries. That has some of the most significant negative outcomes for a person, not only in their ability to be able to have rehabilitation and going on forward, but also just a spiral of secondary complications that could even become life-threatening. But when we're looking at lifetime cost, I mean, these are very, very conservative costs. These are also looking at like more of the medical side and not even taking into account caregiving. Caregiving is in its own little line item, millions and millions and millions of dollars in the lifetime of a person who is a tetraplegic. And so what we see on this page is like, we're talking 5 million, 4 million, even for a paraplegic, millions and millions of dollars just to maintain their life now as a result of a spinal cord injury. What this also doesn't take into effect, and we've talked about this today, was, the change in employment status. The spinal cord injury community has staggering unemployment rates. And I think the statistic 63% is even like gracious. I think closer to 80% of individuals with SCI are unemployed 10 years post-injury. It's really bad. And that's because we don't have enough supports around getting people what they need to be able to be successful, going back to work, transportation, accommodations. There's a spectrum of things that could be its own discussion, but the economic impact of a spinal cord injury is so significant. And so that's why, looking at the full picture of gun violence resulting in paralysis and a spinal cord injury, we cannot have a discussion without understanding the hard realities of the economic impact. I love always hearing from family caregivers because they are the people bringing life back into a person who is injured. But our reality is not everyone has that family member. And the other reality is that is unpaid work. And that brings its own discussion. If someone is lucky enough to be able to find a way through a Medicaid program to have a personal care attendant. Oftentimes they're fighting for hours, but the only way you really can navigate it is through Medicaid funded caregiving, because if you were hiring someone, you're looking at substantial cost, $25 to $40 an hour, and those people deserve to be paid that amount of money. But for a person with a significant spinal cord injury that may not be working, those costs are not feasible. And then looking at other costs related to just the basic functioning, like, do I have a place to live? How can I live there in the most conservative manner? Like Eddie said, like, let's not even look at the elevator. Let's just get me a stair lift. Those costs are substantial. And, for a vehicle, to buy, many people are buying 10, 15-year-old vans and then having to put $50,000 into modifying them. The disability tax is what we call it, and it's real and it is substantial. So we like in the scheme of in the legal world, but also just in an educational sense, a life care plan is looking at every aspect of a person's life now that they have a spinal cord injury and putting a line item cost to that. The catheters, the bowel supplies, the wheelchairs, the modifications needed, the doctor's visits, and so forth. And it's a roadmap of all those future cost and expenses. I use it and I work very closely. And that's actually, there can be a lot of synergy between the legal community and the medical community when we're all trying to work together to help a person after a spinal cord injury, and oftentimes that comes in a life care plan. The doctors really have that medical knowledge to know what the line items need to be. And I'm working alongside to make sure that we're fully accounting for what those costs are in every aspect of a person's life. And then part of it also is like looking into those other costs, like what is the loss of earning? What's the loss of household services? Like if you're a quadriplegic and you no longer can perform, go out and mow your lawn. What's the cost of having someone do that for you? There's just so many line items, and really having to work hand in hand with the medical providers in developing this is so critical because it is the roadmap of a needs. And every person with a spinal cord injury, each life care plan I have, it looks very different because we're looking exactly at the person, what's their age, what their schooling needs are, vocational, medical, level of injury, where they live, geographically, who they live with. There's so many parts of it. And I'm happy to discuss more with anyone about what that looks like. Send them an example of a life care plan if you're curious, because it really is a fundamental piece, guiding document that really shows in a number form what spinal cord injuries cost. So I think I only have like one or two more slides and I'll move through this. But what I know and what I face alongside people I work with who are victims of gun violence is that there are so many challenges trying to get on Medicaid and SSDI. And luckily there are a lot of supports out there, but you kind of have to know about them to even be able to tap into them. I've shared with some people about like the Ticket to Work program and how there's people there that will help guide you. There's also nonprofits specifically for spinal cord injuries that help guide you through navigating Medicaid buy-in programs, just anything you can think of. And I'm happy to connect any of you to those resources just so you have them, knowing that they're there available for anyone that you can pass them along. And then, the unfortunate reality is there is a stigma oftentimes around gun violence and victims of gun violence. And what that turns out to is a disparity in settlements. There may be less money being put on the table than other kinds of cases like a car wreck or a workplace injury. And we are continually fighting to eliminate that stigma, but it is present and exists in the eyes of insurance companies or individuals, businesses. And I think, again, seeing the stories of people living their life, continuing to move forward is so powerful. And I am every time I hear a panel of individuals like April and Shine and Eddie who are victims of gun violence and sharing their stories, like y'all are amazing, and I know I just love hearing your thoughts on life post SCI. And so I think that there's a lot of things we're working on. We're like part of the role as a legal advocate is just being an advocate in the community. Things that we're looking at is changing Medicaid buy-in programs that allow unlimited assets and income so more people can work and be on Medicaid. Looking at how you could be married and fundamental like human rights like that and still be able to get government services. Advocating for more long-term supports for gun violence survivors, and putting it out there that there is a large group of individuals who are thankfully here with us today, but because of gun violence are now living life in a very different way and acknowledging the tremendous supports that are needed for them to move forward and thrive. That was all, but let me stop sharing. So I will put my email here. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with all of you. I hate it's not in person, but I hope to in the future, those of you I haven't met, and always hope to be a resource in this lane I like to stay in, but for all of you and making connections. So thanks for having me. Thank you, Mitchell.
Thank you, Kelly. And I put Kelly's the spinal cord